Bom dia para você que é de bom dia, boa noite para você que é da boa noite, boa tarde se você acabou de receber notificação no YouTube e está vindo a gente. Pela primeira vez você está no bate-papo Mayhem, então não esquece, segue o canal, dá like e dá uma olhada que essa é a entrevista cento e muitos. Faz o seguinte, hoje vai ser entrevista em inglês, então você precisa ativar as legendas e aí do lado colocar no setup traduzir, translate to português. E aí você consegue acompanhar com as legendas. And now, for something completely different, I will change to English because today we have an international guest. And I am a huge fan. YouTube just spoiled her and put her face before I told who she is, but she's a scholar, a writer, a teacher, a professional of tarot with over 40 years. And I met her in 2012 in the tarot event here in Brazil. It was a weekend organized by Artu, and we spent the whole weekend there. It was great, and she's an amazing person. And today we will talk a lot about tarot and how to write with your heart. I would like to thank you, Mary K. Greer. Thank you a lot to agree in having this interview. Good evening.
Good evening, and I'm very happy to be here with you.
Well, first of all, before we begin, I usually ask our guests to tell us a little bit about their journey. I begin joking. I said, how does a normal person wakes up one day and then 40 years later, she's the head of the ISIS Fellowship, has written books and books and books about tarot and traveled the world. How does that happen? How's your journey?
Well, it's actually been 52, 53 years that I've been into tarot. And I don't head the ISIS, but yeah, I'm a priestess, archpriestess, hierophant in it. Well, we have to go back to Christmas of 1967. I was in college, and a friend of mine, my best friend, invited me over on Christmas morning to share what our gifts were. And she had this book by Eden Gray called The Tarot Revealed, a very simple book. But I remember looking at it and being so jealous. So stop me if you want to translate at any point, you know.
No, don't worry. It will translate automatically.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, yeah, I was really jealous to see this book with these beautiful images and that you could actually do readings for people with them. At the time, I was an English major and we were studying archetypal symbolism based on the concepts of Carl Jung as a way to look at literature. So I'm looking at these cards and going, oh my gosh, here are the archetypes that Jung talked about that we look for in literature, but these are ones that can be shuffled and laid out for a person so you can see what the archetypes are doing in that person's life. So that was my revelation. It was like, oh, wow, you know, I can look at a person the same way I've been trained to look at the symbolism in literature. And that just appealed to me. I started trying it out, although following the basic instructions. It didn't look at all like a Jungian approach at the time because I was just going, well, this is what the book says, and these are what the cards mean, and telling people. And so they started bringing their friends over and asking me to do readings for their friends, and it just kept going from there. So, but the connection with the ideas of Carl Jung and also Joseph Campbell, because his Hero with a Thousand Faces was relatively new, and I had just gotten into that. So I had the hero's journey, and I had the idea of how symbols and archetypes relate to an individual, and these cards that depicted that. And I decided in that first year that someday I was going to teach tarot as an academic subject in college, which I've done, and that I would, when I was an elderly person, I would finally write my great work on tarot. So luckily, I ended up in a long-term relationship and marriage with a man who had published several books, and he said, "No, do it now." So I started writing much sooner than that in 1984. But by then, I'd been teaching tarot in college and privately for, oh, let me see, if I wrote it in 80, the book came out in 84, my first book. So I had been teaching in colleges for about 10 years at that point. So I had a lot of homework assignments and handouts that I basically put together for my first book, Tarot for Yourself.
Okay. Well, we will start slowly here. The first question that I always ask our guests is, what is magic to you? But since you are a writer, an English teacher, an English study, and what do you think the connection between tarot and magic for you, for your perspective?
Well, my favorite definition of magic comes from Florence Farr, who, and I kind of twisted it around a little bit, but basically she said that magic is unlimiting our experience, taking the limits off what we can experience. So when we can see something beyond the norm and have experiences beyond the norm, we're already doing magic, I think. But there's also Aleister Crowley's definition that was modified by Dion Fortune, which is magic is the art and science of creating change, or creating a change in consciousness, according to Dion Fortune, according to our will. So that's a little more directive, but I see that too. In practice, the best kind of magic for me is when you become aware of the stream in which you are flowing. You know, what's the stream of energy and events that's already there and already flowing? Because if you use your will to go against the stream, against the river, or against the flow, then you're fighting all the time, and there can be all kinds of dangers and things that go wrong. But if you work with the way the stream is flowing, and you can use your will, your consciousness, to kind of edge towards the bank, towards the edge, the way where you want to. So it's more like gently working with what already exists rather than fighting that, and finding the places where you can kind of enhance what it is that you want to create. But I don't really believe, or it's not that it's impossible, I just think it's very dangerous to be going against what already exists in nature and consciousness.
I was looking here and it said that as an expert tarot reader, you are considered a midwife of the soul. What does that mean? I think the concept is great, but can you explain?
Well, that came up. I was living in Mexico. I took a break from a year off from college teaching, and I was pregnant at the time. So I was doing a lot of work because I didn't have to be anywhere. I could be at home. And so I was doing a lot of yoga and a lot of thinking about, you know, how do you work with the energies of pregnancy? And let's see, how do I want to explain this? Go back to the question so I can answer the question and not go off too much.
No, don't worry. If you want to go off, it's okay. I would like to say this, your work as a midwife of the soul. So like a person gives birth to a soul, and in a person that has no soul. But I think the concept is great. It was
the whole midwife thing. Yeah,
like
because I had several friends who were midwives who were advising me during this time that I was pregnant in Mexico and had lots of time to do all this yoga and inner work. So the midwife thing came when one of the friends who was a midwife and had written books on midwifery that my husband had illustrated with his photographs. So the idea is that A midwife is mit-wife. That's a German term, with the wife. The midwife is not doing anything except supporting the process that the woman and child are going through. And so for me, the tarot reading is to assist the process that the client is going through. And therefore, I ask questions, having them looking at the cards whenever that's possible. And I ask them questions to go deeper into the cards so that they can discover their own truth. So I help to bring them to bring their own wisdom to birth, is the way I see it. I'm the midwife who's supporting and helping and guiding their process. And that's why I work more psychologically than I do in terms of prediction, fortune telling, or even traditional magical spreads.
The symbolical approach, I find it fantastic. Some of the people, before we interview you, they asked me to ask you about today. Most of our viewers are 20, 30 something year old. So they're born into the internet. And you start studying tarot at the same time the books were being written, and before some of the books being written. So you don't have to research that, you practically discover them and in practice. How was this this aspect of discovering how it connected with astrology, with psychology, with the symbols?
Yeah.
It was basically a pioneer work.
Well, I basically tell people that I can teach in one course, several week course, what it took me 7 years to learn. So it took me a long time of studying and reaching out and slowly meeting people who are interested in tarot and putting it all together, a very long time. But then when I'm teaching it, I was able to bring these experiences to people. And I've always taught in a very experiential way. I think it's much more important to do the work yourself. But, I'd give them handouts with all the astrological information, all the Kabbalistic associations. But the more important part was actually having them do the readings and having that experience of it. And then they can add that informational part whenever it interests them, whenever they feel drawn to it. But it's actually getting in and doing the work with the symbols. So that's the key, is getting people interacting with the symbols.
And talk about symbols. What is your favorite tarot?
The Rider-Waite-Smith deck.
Just still, because most of the answers, they were betting that would be something between Crowley and the mythological or something like that. I said, no, sure, like the Rider-Waite. It's a classic one.
Yeah, yes. I do, because, well, it was the first one I started out with. But what I've found is that, oops, wait 1 second. I just have to see if this is an emergency.
Okay. Oh.
Sorry, I just got a delivery of flowers.
Flowers. Jung says synchronicity.
Yes. So the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Okay. What I have found is that when people describe the cards and talk about the symbols and, who is the Knight of Cups, and they're looking at this card, or, tell me about what this card, just simply describe the card and then tell me a little story about what's going on in the card. What people say is very close to what is in the book, with some exceptions. If they're really blocking some energy, then they're going to come up with something very different. And it's obvious that something deep is going on for them. It's unusual. But for the most part, people are going to respond to these cards very closely to what you will find in the modern books on tarot, starting with Eden Gray and most of the books that are published, at least in English now. So I like working with it because I can work with all my correspondences, all of my systems at the same time, and people can see where I'm coming from. They can see that this card is related to Leo, whereas you can't do that with all the modern decks. And I love the Thoth deck. I've used that quite a bit and taught with it in classes. But for many people, you ask them to look at a card, describe it, and they don't know what to say. They don't know how to describe it because they feel like they should know something about art in order to be able to describe those patterns in the background. And so they get lost in it. So, and also with the minor arcana, there's no scenes on the cards. There's no, action going on in the cards. So it's hard for them to come up with a story that relates to it. I use fairy tales a lot. Tell people to tell me a once upon a time story if this was in a child's fairy tale book. And then we see how everything they said relates to the meaning of the card. But specifically, how it relates to them and the meaning of the card.
We were talking about before we recorded about the connection between Carl Jung and tarot and the therapeutic style reading versus a traditional predictive fortune telling one. Said you like use tarot as a therapy and storytelling. What's the difference between the people who like to use tarot as to predict the future and the people who like to use it as inner conscious and to improve someone's self-awareness of the world?
Self-development, the human potential movement, looking at all of that. I think that all ways of reading the tarot are absolutely fascinating. And when done by somebody who's really good at it, I am in great awe and admiration of that. So I believe just like there are all different kinds of doctors, there's doctors for cancer, for feet problems, for heart, you go to a specialist. And so the best in any field within tarot, any style, is perfect. But for me, I feel like if I'm giving somebody answers, this is what's going to happen to you in 6 months. And if it's absolutely true, then they give all their power over to me. They are going to come to me and they're going to know exactly what to do, how to handle their life, exactly what's going to happen. And even if the biggest danger is if I'm absolutely correct, the more correct I am, the more the person wants to give over their power, their volition, their will to me. And I don't want it. I don't think it's healthy for them, and I don't think it's certainly not healthy for me to take that on, all of that. So one of my big rules is I don't have to fix anyone. And I have to often stop myself from trying to do that because in a reading, it's very tempting to go in and fix somebody's life, showing them where the right path is. I'd much rather a person comes to a realization of what for them is the right path, even if it's not, in my opinion, the best path. I will state perhaps what my opinion is, or as an alternate path, an alternate possibility. I do share those things with people, but I always make sure to acknowledge and honor what they're seeing, what they're reflecting on. And a good example of that was a reading I did for a woman about her relationship. And it became very obvious that the man she was involved with was emotionally abusive to her, and that this was not a healthy relationship. At the end of a reading, one of the processes I do is I ask her to pick one of the cards from the spread that represents the qualities she most wanted to develop in herself through this experience she was going through. So if that became, the impetus for her to develop something in herself. And she picked the Empress so that she could be kinder toward him, understand him more, nurture him more. And I just sort of looked at her and she started laughing and she said, I know you wouldn't pick this card, but I still need to do this. And I could honor and hear that because I stayed in a marriage for several years after I knew that we were going to get divorced. There were reasons for doing that. We all have our reasons for going through difficult times. and often choosing things that we know are not the best for us. Often there's a lesson to be learned or something that I can't even understand at this point. So, I want to honor that. At the same time, because of the reading, she couldn't fool herself in the same way that she was doing before. And I got that by her realization that, I would have chosen something different. She was very intelligent, that she could see in me. So I kind of sat there and stared at her. So, we worked with how to best express that desire that she had, so that she could continue on this path until she got the lesson that she needed to get.
Yes. I have a
Yeah.
question here from Adriani and from Elisa. They ask, what is the Fellowship of Isis?
Oh, the Fellowship of Isis is a religious organization that was founded by Lady Olivia Robertson and her brother, Lawrence Durden Robertson, who lived in a family castle in Ireland. They both have since died. But in the basement of the castle, there was a well, a very ancient well. And Lawrence Durden Robertson, who was an Episcopal minister, became fascinated with the well and got into the whole idea of Bridget, who was a sacred goddess of the wells in the Celtic countries. And so as he started studying her, he realized that all the ideas he was coming across were things that he believed much more in than he did in his Episcopal practice. So he decided to form, I guess, a new religious organization based on goddess worship. So Isis actually stands in for one of her attributes, which is the goddess of 1,000 faces. And those 1,000 faces are all the different forms of the goddess and all of her consorts and children in all the myths around the world. So what the Fellowship of Isis does is it studies and learns from all of these different myths of the goddess and her consorts and her children, and brings that into our contemporary world, especially in our relationship to nature, to living on this planet. And so there are practically no rules other than a love of the goddess. So I really was drawn to it because it didn't have this set of belief systems, beliefs that you had to go along with, the heavy dogma, because I've never been one to follow along with that. I can learn from it, but I don't want to be restricted. Magic is unlimiting our experience. So I wanted that ability to go where the experience itself was taking me rather than where dogma told me to go. And I fell in love with Lady Olivia Robertson, who was about 93 when I met her, and just such an amazing woman. She lived much longer than her brother and would travel all over the world in her 90-year-old, to different groups where she would do initiations with people who'd been, you did have to study for a year and a day. That was one of the few rules. And you had to honor the planet and the goddess and not bring harm to others. So no rituals or ways of doing things that brought harm. But other than that, I think there were only like 3 basic rules, if I remember right. It's been many years. So, and I no longer am involved in ordaining priestesses because I've just been so much involved in travels with tarot that I had to put that aside.
Oh yeah, I will ask about that later. We value something that we call the true will. Is that when most of my guests, they are living their true will. But first, I'd like to ask you about the 4 female magicians that you wrote a biography on. Because the magic world is so full of male magicians, and it's Crowley and Edgar Wade and tal. And there are very few people talk about the famous women. I'd like you to say something about the 4 magicians that you wrote about to my audience.
Well, one of the reasons that we don't hear that much about them is that they usually kept their lives very private, and none of these women except Maud Gonne ever became really famous the way a lot of the male magicians have become. And therefore, they didn't have other people writing about them, which was one of the reasons why I wanted to find every little piece of anything, any information I could find in order to put together this story and or the biographies. So the fact that the Golden Dawn is one of the few 19th century or earlier organizations that had men and women working together as equals in their magical work was one of the first things that really drew me to the whole Golden Dawn in the first place. But it was because women had as much opportunity and theoretically at least as much respect in doing their magic as the men did. So that was one of the big draws for me to the Golden Dawn. And then just the women's lives were so fascinating. I was already familiar with Maud Gonne, who was an Irish revolutionary, because she inspired so much of the poetry of William Butler Yeats. And I was an English major, so I was very familiar with Yeats and the fact that a great many of his poems were written to Maud Gonne. So I had a little bit of background on her. And then Moyna Mathers, she was actually Moyna Bergson Mathers, was the sister of a very famous philosopher, Henri Bergson, and married one of the founders of the Golden Dawn. Supposedly, according to little mentions here and there, she channeled a lot of the more advanced rituals. And so I'm going, oh, here, a lot of the material was coming through her. She was also an artist, so a lot of the artwork that they use was first drawn by her. But we have very little of what was actually created by her. So I wanted to find out everything I could about her. She sounded like a fascinating person. And then Florence Farr was an actress, and I had minored in theater in college. And so there was always this intrigue with, how did someone be an actress and a magician and come to be the head of the London Temple, and then caused or be very active part of the breakup of the Golden Dawn, because this was obviously a woman who was not just going to follow orders, but would follow her conscience and what her conscience was saying. And then Annie Horniman was a wealthy woman who never married, lived her own life the way she wanted to, but financed the Golden Dawn. And also was a woman who was kind of a rabble rouser, in that when there was something that didn't seem right to her, kind of a sexual abuse situation, she got very angry about it, and eventually that was what caused her to leave. So I admired the women who would stand up for their principles.
You have traveled all around the world. You lived in Mexico, Japan, Germany, England. How is tarot views from the people who live there? Do you see difference between how do they connect to the tarot in different countries?
Well, part of it is I lived in these different places at different times of my life. So Japan and Germany before I ever got into tarot. I lived in England. That's when I had already been interested in both astrology and tarot. So I did follow it up while I was in England. I became friends with someone who was managing Atlantis Bookshop, which is a very famous occult bookshop in London. And I ended up with a couple of books and things that he gave me. So I went to classes. So I did, but I couldn't find any tarot classes. So it was actually me doing readings for other people more than learning about that while I was in England. But through the years, I've gone back many times and gone to conferences in London. So that's pretty much the same traditions that I follow. Mexico was probably the biggest difference because there was much more of an emphasis, especially at the time I was there in the 80s, on more of the fortune telling aspect. And I've trained myself so that I feel that I can offer that kind of reading, but it's not my favorite. So I do a combination when I'm with people who really just want to know what's going to happen. It's like I will try to see what there is and the cards say around that. But also in Mexico, where I worked mostly with a translator when I did do readings. I would try to guide them a little bit into what they were seeing in the cards to open up those possibilities. I also teach in China. I've been going to China a couple of times a year, and now I'm doing Zoom classes. So with a translator. Again, it's similar to Mexico, where there's an expectation of it's going to be more fortune telling and predictive and telling people what to do with their lives. They've been asking me to come because there's more and more interest there in the more psychological or therapeutic kind of approach, and getting people involved in feeling comfortable doing readings for themselves for that self-development that you were talking about earlier. So they're welcoming my approach. At the same time, they realize that most of their clients are going to have that heavy expectation of answers being given to them by the reader. So it's how can we kind of trick somebody into going further than they even thought, and discovering that there's ways to view their life and their options and their destiny or destination, their goal, as coming from themselves rather than from the reader, that the reader becomes the guide to that process. So luckily in China, there's quite a few people who have been getting into Jungian psychology and are very interested in adding this approach. But it's also an uphill battle for them because they have to also be able to provide that more concrete, this is what's going on in your life. This is your past, your present, your future. And this is what you can do about it, which I prefer somebody coming to a realization of what they can do about it for themselves.
So how's that? How can one use tarot to improve their writing abilities?
To be absolutely honest, I've been going through a very difficult time of needing to be working on a book on Jung and tarot and having a hard time writing it, partly because I feel that right now we're on this cusp of major shifts and changes in consciousness. This whole experience that we're having, working internationally with people through online forums and Zoom and other methods that are not in person. It's very, very exciting, but it's also shifting, I think, our consciousness and our awareness and our expectations of what we're doing. And so I'm in a very frustrating place myself of trying to write and then feeling I'm not really getting in touch with what's going to be important, what the change is. I'm 73 years old. One of the ideas is that when new knowledge and information comes in, it doesn't take over the whole consciousness of the people until all the people who held the previous way of thinking die off. So I'm right there on the cusp. It's kind of like Moses standing at the edge of the land of Israel and not being able to enter in. So I feel like there's a huge shift happening, and that's affecting my writing in ways that it never did before. So if I go back and one other thing I want to mention about the shift, one of the big shifts, because I'm writing about Jung, is about the anima and the animus. The anima, according to Jung, very strictly is found only in men, and it's the contrasexual part of the self. The other, if you're a man, then it's the inner female. If you're a woman, then the animus is the inner male within you. And it follows very strict traditional guidelines. Well, we've got flexible sexuality nowadays, people changing, transsexual, gays being accepted, marriage between gay people. I've always wanted to have my own anima. And when I was teaching goddess workshops, women's spirituality, I claimed an anima within myself. I didn't want to leave it up to the inspiratrix kind of energy of the goddess being available only to men. So I claimed her. But how do I write about that for a world in which people are setting new standards and exploring things in new ways that I'm just beginning to learn about? So I've been putting a lot of energy into that. Previously, writing my books came largely out of workshops and classes I was teaching. So I would create handouts for my students and use those handouts as the basis for the exercises in my books. So almost all of the exercises in my books have been tested over and over again with students. For many years, I did classes in my home regularly. So we would have 12 weeks or sometimes even 22 weeks of a class, and would really go deeply into the cards. And like I said, do these experiential things that I would write up or give them homework to do at home. Tarot for yourself, how could they take it deeper for themselves? So it was very easy kind of transferring the handouts and the things I created into the books. I'm now in this stage where I don't know how to create the experiences for people who are going through things that are beyond what my own level of experience is. So I can understand dilemmas that people have when they're doing it. Going to the cards helps. I get moments where going back to them, I go, oh, yes, this is what it's all about. It doesn't matter what you call it. I call the anima and the animus now the animaus, putting together the two words. And that there is an inner experience, and we do respond to our social conditioning. So that's the place that I'm working on right now, because I feel like there's a big jump. And that happens in all of my other books, and I'm pretty sure it will happen in this one. There's a place where my inner experience suddenly comes into connection with what I'm writing about in the book. When I wrote Tarot Reversals, my initial claim was that too many people saw reverse cards as being negative, something bad. If you have the Empress, yes, if you have the Empress reversed, then it's the bad mother, not nurturing, not loving yourself, your if you're a female, your body, not making a connection with an important woman if you're a man, or having, whether it's a mother or a lover, if it's for a man that, the relationship's not working well together. I wanted to break that apart and find the good sides of the reverse meanings. And I did come up with a lot of them, because I've tended to use reversals as more inner than outer anyway. But also I see that it's often an area that you're blocking, resisting, in denial about, kind of shadow material, which is often seen as negative. So what happened was, in writing the book, I had more really difficult things happen to me than I had ever had in a year-long period. Stepdaughter got cancer. There were major accidents, falling down, and really serious accidents, breaking an ankle, and I got divorced. So all of these things were going on, and I had to acknowledge at some point that, yes, reversals are difficult. And so there came another level to the book that was not where I started at all. So in a sense that you plunge into the book, you keep working on it, you keep using the cards, doing readings about the experience. Don't be in despair if you don't understand a reading, because in my book, 21 Ways to Read a Tarot Card, I would do sample readings of my own. And 6 months later, I would have something happen that was exactly what that reading had been about. So I was able to show what my first impression of a reading was. And I would often leave it there at my first insight. And then as I was finishing the book, I was able to add material about how all of these different readings that I saw in one light when I was beginning the book now had these additional dimensions to them because I actually experienced them. I was doing a meditation at Big Sur, which is a New Age center right on the coast of the ocean. And so I was in this beautiful meditation place all by myself. And I'm sitting there looking around and realized that I had a spread that had every element. I had done one, months earlier that had every single image and symbol in it as the place I was at then sitting doing this meditation. It was all there. So I had grown into it and come into it. So what I'm trying to work with myself is just telling myself, go ahead and explain things, the dilemma of how do I look at the anima and the animus when I know we're right on the edge of a cliff of a new world in relationship to that. Well, do a reading about it and know that it's not the final answer. A lot of tarot is not the absolute answer. It's part of the process. So I don't know if that explains to you.
Yes, you said brilliantly. Gabriel asked me, because since you gave a lot of classes to Chinese, how do they see tarot in counterpoint to the I Ching?
I think they keep them, very different because the Chinese and most Asians are very, very sophisticated in their knowledge of Western culture. So my translator is working on material that has to do with Greek myth. And she's as knowledgeable or more so than I am about it. There are certain cards that my limited knowledge of Chinese culture and history and so on suggests to me something that might be part of the Chinese culture. And when I present it, it's kind of like, yeah, okay, but it's really whatever it is in the Western culture. So the I Ching, they can express their Asian culture. And with tarot, there's much more of an interest in using the Western symbolism and symbolic mythology, the Jungian psychology, rather than translating it into something that's uniquely Chinese. Because actually in our modern world, that doesn't really exist anymore. So many people, especially in Asia, are really sophisticated about Western culture. They've been watching movies for ever since they were little children, and I think they've got those two minds. So they'll do Western astrology and they'll do Chinese astrology, but they don't often mix them. When I ask my Chinese students to look at the 4 suits of the minor arcana in terms of blood types, which is a big system in Asia, what blood type you are determines your personality and who you're most compatible with in terms of marriage, all kinds of things like that. They're kind of going, yes, but, and when I had them pick which ones would be associated with which suit, everyone had a different choice and idea about which it would be. So I realized at some point that, maybe somebody can make it work, but for the most part, they would keep it separate. Two different parts of the brain. That may change over time.
I have a question from Elisa. She says, Mary, it looks like you have the vision of a storyteller meets we say tarologa in English, it's the tarot reader. It's a mix of storyteller and tarot reader. And how do you see these functions interact with each other? Because when you say you were talking about the books you wrote, we can see that your eyes glow in ecstasy.
Yeah.
And she saw that. She says, what's your joy to bring this inspiration to people, the tarot as an inspirational key?
Yeah. Because I see the tarot as being at its best when it's personal, when it comes from the individual. I love doing classes where I can see that realization coming into people's eyes. When I do a Zoom class, it's not as apparent. When I'm live in a class, I can really, I can help people come to that point where they realize their own insight, that they said something that really makes it all come into place, coming together. Their situation where they come to a realization of what they need to do. That to me is the greatest joy that I can possibly experience. And anything I do that's less than that is, I feel like I'm giving them not my best. So, and that happens with the Zoom classes. I can give a lot of information and present to some extent some experiences, depending on the form. With China, it's difficult because we have to translate back and forth, but I've been doing more and more of the experiential part with the China classes as they become more familiar with me. To me, it really is about people discovering that these cards speak to them. I recently gave a talk in Israel on the court cards, and I was going to go through and give some of the court cards, the basic meanings of what a court card is. And when I got up there, I realized that's going to be in all the books. It's a kind of a waste of time to do that. And what I really do with court cards is I realized at some point, because if you do a 10-card reading and 6 cards are court cards, most people go, what do I do? How do I handle 6 cards being court cards in this 10-card reading? The court cards have lots of opinions. They know what you should do from their own point of view. And so in a reading, that's one of the major ways in which I use them. We can identify them with people in the client's life. But the real point is that in the experience of their situation, those people that are in their life that are represented by the court cards are also people in their heads. So, for instance, a card comes up, the Queen of Pentacles, and I identify it with my mother. Well, I know what my mother would say about this situation, and especially this particular aspect of my mother. I know exactly what she would say. And so in readings, I ask the person, what does the Knight of Cups think that you should do about this? And what does the Queen of Pentacles recommend? What's her opinion about all of this? And sometimes people say, well, I don't know what she thinks. And I say, if you did know what she thought, what would it be? So far, everybody has responded with something right away. It's kind of like I give them permission to make it up. But really what it is it's that voice inside their head. So 6 court cards in a spread means that there's 6 different voices in your head that you would probably associate with different people that have opinions about what you should do and what the situation is really involved in and where it's going to go. And so if you find out what all of these different voices say, then you can choose among them which one or what combination of them is the best advice. Also, usually because of position meanings, you've got the voice from the past, the voice in the present, the voice in the future. So you also have some guidance and sense about that based on what the position meaning is. If you're using a Jungian spread, the voice from the shadow, the voice from your ego. And so you can kind of put those together and give different value to the different voices. And then make up your own mind how you're going to combine it, just as if you had a bunch of friends at a coffee shop all giving you advice.
Got it. I have a question from Jara. She said, my question is, why is it so hard to make a reading of tarot to yourself? How can we improve that? She said she has just started reading tarot.
If you want a truly objective view with a probable future that's very objectively determined, go to a tarot reader. Doing it for yourself, you're going to get more of your own feelings about the situation, your fears, your anxieties, your hopes, your dreams, being too optimistic or too pessimistic. But that's the strength of reading for yourself. If you want to come to know yourself better and you want to be a better tarot reader, then do the readings for yourself. Write down exactly what the situation is and what you think the cards mean and how you think they're going to end up, what your prediction is based on it. And then watch and come back a week later, a month or two later, 6 months later, a year later, maybe even 10 years, 20 years later. I've done that with a few readings. And write down what actually happened and how you see it from this new perspective. You're going to learn how you fool yourself, where you lie to yourself, where you're more too optimistic or too pessimistic. And you'll begin to recognize that when you're doing the reading so that you can correct it, which means that when you're reading for a client, you notice right away when they're lying to themselves because you recognize it because you've done it to yourself and you've forced yourself to find out where and how you do that. I do that with prediction readings in classes as we do. Everybody does a spread for the coming week about something that's very likely to happen that week, but they don't know exactly how it's going to happen. So everybody does a prediction for the coming week. And then they come back the next week for the next class, and we look at their predictions and how right were they. So many people go, well, I know I said that this wasn't going to happen like this, but I really meant that it would, but it would just be out of the blue or something. They start justifying why their wrong answer was really right. And I call them on it. I say, no, that's not what you said. We have it here in black and white. We have your prediction. And you need to look at, now we're all going to look at your spread and say, where is it that you either went wrong or understood it differently or needed to be working more psychologically rather than materially. We had one woman who her father, she's given me permission to talk about this. Her father had just died and she had to go to his home and get all of his bank material and go to the bank to close out his bank accounts. And so she was very worried that she would just get really emotional and not be able to handle it and not be able to do it, and that she wouldn't get this work done because it would be too overwhelming to her. So she saw that as kind of a prediction that it was, she would go into a real mental collapse. What happened was she got to the bank and there was a bank robbery. And there was a small child with her father, and the father was trying to be really brave and maybe do something about it, and the child was panicked, and she had to protect the child. She had to calm down the child. And so all her focus went on the child. And she realized there were many, many other things that related to specific images in the cards. Whoops. So specific things that were in the cards. So Sorry. It's a message from beyond. Wait, I can't stop it.
It's okay because the next question is from beyond.
Yeah. Yes, it was a message from beyond. So, but let me just finish this. One last thing was that she realized that the small child that she was protecting in the bank was herself in relation to her own father. Oh. And so the actual and the spread that she had done explained everything.
But the tarot is always right, isn't it?
Yes. And so, but it wasn't good at actually predicting the very specific thing that she thought was going to happen. And that was the big learning, I think, for everybody, that actually predictions change all the time. The circumstances change. And so I tried to do a prediction for my son-in-law getting a particular job, and it looked really good for him. But it turned out that, yes, he was being well received for the job, except that the person who was offering the job decided that he wasn't going to have that position at all, that he was just not going to hire anybody and was going to do away with that part of the work that he had done. So the question, was he going to get the job or not, became invalid. So I realized that many times we try to predict something that's going to so totally change that it's not really, that's not the point. And so my basic statement about tarot is tarot helps you meet whatever comes in the best possible way. Not that we are going to predict specifically what's going to happen, but that we can prepare you to meet it as an opportunity for learning, for growth, for development, for compassion, for whatever.
The next question is from Elisa. I have to explain you why first, because in Brazil, I don't know if you've seen when you came here, we have a religion called Umbanda and Candomblé that are very similar to the Voodoo, the Santeria.
Yeah.
Some people here from these religions, they use the tarot and other oracular decks to communicate with the other entities and the spirits and things like that, like an Ouija board.
Yeah.
I don't know if something like that. Do you have anything to say about?
Well, that's very similar to what I was talking about, conversing with the inner voices, but it can also be ancestors. I don't try to make a definitive a statement whether something is an inner voice within you, an inner part of the psyche, or if it's a god or goddess. I mean, I'm a priestess in the Fellowship of Isis. When I am doing my priestess work, I communicate with goddess. But it doesn't matter to me whether goddess is inner or outer. When I'm doing my priestess work, she is the supreme being. And I give myself totally over to her, and miraculous things have happened, you know, above and beyond. So I don't question those. In communicating with the cards, sometimes I feel like I'm in touch with something above and beyond me, but I don't feel a need to, you know, make a definitive separation as to whether this is inner or outer. I trust when I go into those modes that I'm dealing with something bigger than me. And so you know, when you're working with the cards, you're working with what I call, you know, Jung called archetypal energies that are found in all the myths of the gods and goddesses, as well as within the psyche of the individual simultaneously, as above, so below. I don't need to differentiate those unless I'm specifically working with the psyche versus working with ritual and goddess, in which case I give myself totally over to the experience of the moment.
I have another question. This is from Maria João. She's from Lisboa, Portugal. And if you wish to create another card that was never created in tarot, What kind of card would it be?
Whoa. If I've never thought of it before, how can I think of it now? Well, I think partly because of being in the midst of the coronavirus, COVID, and the pandemic and all we're going through, I felt like, as I mentioned before, Moses standing on that cliff edge looking off into this new world. And so I think I would want something that expressed the unknown, and that I would feel, sometimes it would be a terrifying feeling. Like in meditation, when you start feeling vertigo, do you pull back out of the meditation because you're starting to feel nauseated or sick from this vertigo? Or do you let yourself fall into it? In which case, sometimes you end up amazing places. So I would want a card that would be kind of that unknown, and in different readings, sometimes I'd want to back away from it, and sometimes I'd want to give myself over to it. That just came.
And also on the spirit things, here in Brazil, we have something called the constellations. I don't know if in US you have something like that. She said that Bert Hellinger has an amazing work and legacy. In Brazil, the constellation is like, how can I explain that to you? It's a kind of therapy where you use the tarot with the therapy, and the cards, and you use some dolls to represent persons on your life. And some of the constellations, they use tarot cards, and she's asking if you know. It's called systemic constellations in English.
No, I'm not familiar with it. It sounds a little bit like a crossover from sand play therapy, where you create that, but more formalized, maybe. In Jung, there's also what he called the complexes, which consist of your parental patterns and other patterns that you automatically are triggered by a situation. Is that anything like that?
I'm asking her. She said that you wrote a book about it.
Well, the tarot constellations are the birth cards that are personal to you based on your birthday.
How does that work?
Okay. You take the month, day, and year you were born, and you add them together like a child's addition thing, where you've got the month number up at the top, and then just below it you have the day, and below that you have the year. You add that, and then you reduce it, the sum, which means you add whatever your sum was, your total, you add all the numbers in that. It's theosophic reduction. And you take any number that is 22 or below as one of your birth cards. If it's over 22, like if your sum added up to 28, then you would add 2 plus 8, and that's 10. And there's one situation where you can have the total be a 19. So that's a sun card, but you also add 1 plus 9, and that's 10, the Wheel of Fortune, and 1 plus 0 is 1, the Magician. That's the only time where you've got 3 cards that add to each other. But you also have the 20, the 11, and the 2. So they all add up together. So those are your birth cards, and they are like looking at your astrological cards. So it's very similar to astrology. The combination of, I use 22 as the Fool, so just for this purpose. And so you've got the Emperor and the Fool. Well, you have all these great myths that talk about the Emperor and the Fool. You have the Emperor's New Clothes, where it's a small child, a fool, who points to the Emperor and says, "Look, Ma, he has no clothes on." That story. You have Shakespeare's King Lear, where the king becomes more and more foolish and childlike, and his fool, his literal fool, becomes more and more kingly. And so they kind of switch roles in the play. And then the Nasruddin stories in the Middle East, where you have this foolish Nasruddin, a foolish mullah, a foolish teacher, who always says absurd things. And a king is recognized for his wisdom when he recognizes the true wisdom of the mullah, of this absurd stories. And so over and over again, we've got these relationships. So people who have that combination have the two sides to themselves. One other card is part of that grouping, and that's the death card, numbered 13. 1 + 3 = 4. And so if the fool is the soul before incarnation, and to incarnate, he jumps off the cliff and into the world of the emperor, which in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, he's sitting at the bottom of a cliff. That's one reason why I like this deck, is that there's all those kinds of associations. So he jumps into the material world of the emperor, that the emperor rules. And then emperors try to make themselves immortal in some way by naming things after themselves, by having their sons rule after them. So this kind of immortality, because the biggest thing they're afraid of is death. So death separates the fool, or the soul has to go through a death of the spirit to come into the material world. And then from the material world, we go through a death in order to go back to the world of spirit. So there's all these wonderful teachings in these combinations. Each one has their own story. And we look at how psychologically that is a person's individual story. So the emperor fool then has some way in which it's difficult for them to let go of things. I recently did a reading for somebody who didn't know how to retire. He really wants to retire. He needs to retire, but he just can't let go. He can't give himself over to the death of his professional life. And he goes back and forth between this kind of emperor fool energy in his own life. So you can really see how these play out. And then you can look at your year card. You take the month you were born, the day you were born, and the current year. Add those up, and then add that sum across. And you keep any number that's 22 or below. And that's your year card. And you can look through the pattern of your years.
Oh, that's really, really, really nice. I have another question that they say, thank you so much, you're very inspiring. In your opinion, what's the best virtue a tarologist should work on?
I think it's to be a lifelong learner and to realize that first, develop what interests you the most. Wherever your interest takes you in tarot, follow that, go with that, and learn everything you can about that. And then start going for the things that you don't like in tarot. You don't like history. So there's a certain point where you need to look at the history of tarot. And even if it's a little difficult, go into it if you have to put it aside for a couple of years. But at some point, if you're really serious about tarot, you need to come back to that. I periodically will teach and study with a deck that is not my number one favorite deck in order to bring a different mindset. I also will go through a period where I do a lot of psychic events, psychic reading events where you do readings for 15 minutes, where I have to do more of those traditional fortune telling kind of readings in order to strengthen and develop that side of myself. So I think that start with what most intrigues you and most excites you, but go back and try and fill in. And that's the virtue, is that you don't stop and you don't just become one thing, but to expand your knowledge and to learn. Even if I don't become the best psychic reader, I have enough knowledge to really respect and understand what it is that a really good psychic reader is doing. And I know who to recommend if somebody needs that kind of reading. So become the most rounded person you possibly can, but also really honor your own strengths.
I always ask if you give some advice to the beginners, that people who are beginning right now into the tarot.
Okay, my number one advice for the cards is when you look at a card and you go blank, simply describe the card. No interpretation, no meanings, no symbolism, simply describe the card. And then if you want to go a little deeper, look at it and say, what seems to be the emotion, the feeling, the attitude of the person or persons on the card? And what's the atmosphere and mood of the environment? And then tell a little story about it. And then look at all of those things you've said metaphorically. How are those things happening in your own life? You know, where are you all tied up? Where are you tied up 7 times? What are those swords that are behind you? And so first you describe the card, and then you own that for yourself and say, where is that happening in your own life? And I think that's the best way to read them.
Well, that's great advice. And how can we find you? Or there's the last question. Then I will open the mics for people to ask questions to you.
Great. Yeah.
And how can we find you in your course, your books and everything? And to you that is at home, whatever she says, it will be in the description of the video.
My Facebook page, it's a personal page, so I'm usually at the maximum number of friends, but you can follow me and just go to my page every once in a while. I announce whenever I'm doing interviews or teaching classes on there. And sometimes I announce on Instagram. I'm trying to be better. So go to my Instagram page. I have a blog, but I just had a problem with some of the messages not getting to me, directly to me. I think I fixed it. So you can send me a message through my blog. Facebook Messenger is the best way if you really need to get in touch with me. I usually check that out. So yeah, those are the best ways to reach me and to find out what's going on. My blog, Facebook, Instagram.
That was supposed to be the last question, but they had one more. So
Yeah.
What were your impressions of Brazil?
Oh, well, I didn't get to see very much of it because I was pretty much only at the center where we were. But I did get to meet a lot of people who I loved. The people. So for me, Brazil is about the people that I met. And such incredible variety, so enthusiastic, so energized. Rarely, I mean, ceremonies that would go on all night long, and I couldn't stay up all night. Things like that we rarely do here in the States. We don't go that far that we give ourselves over as completely as doing those all night rituals. I've only done a few times in my life. Yeah, the enthusiasm, the variety of people, of ideas that were being shared at that conference, the fact that people could work with both the gypsy cards and some esoteric level of Golden Dawn correspondences in the tarot, and the combination that people were not afraid to work. When somebody comes to a tarot reader in the States, you read tarot. Maybe you do a little Reiki with them, and maybe a touch of astrology, just a little bit. But it seemed like with people in Brazil, people would come to you for assistance, for help, and everyone there would use whatever techniques they had, of which tarot was one. But it wasn't separated out from life in the same way where we tend to kind of, okay, I am a tarot reader, so we are going to read the cards. And I might mention that this card is associated with Aries, but I'm not going to switch to an astrology reading, because you want tarot. So I really appreciated that more holistic sense. And I think that maybe I'm assuming it, but that it characterizes the people, so many mixes of cultures and backgrounds and races, and ability to work in these different modes seamlessly. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Or am I? Yeah.
Well, I think I hope that we get a vaccine soon so we can bring you back to Brazil.
Oh, I want to come and travel. I want to spend some time and go places and stay with people. And yeah.
Next time we will take you to a terreiro to see
Yeah.
the entities and spirits and everything.
I would love that. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I will just say goodbye. You're wonderful. I love you.
Oh, thank you.
I'll just say goodbye and then I open the mic so people here will ask you more questions. So, para você que acompanhou a gente até agora, não esquece, dá o seu like, segue o canal e dá uma olhada nas próximas entrevistas do Bate-Papo Mayhem.